Colonel Potter, sir, my last wish is to be buried in my mother's wedding gown.
I've seen these Dodgers for 40 years, all the tricks. Dismissed!
There is a moment near the end of a Season 3 episode of MASH where a young corporal walks into a crowded operating room, removes his cap, and delivers a single sentence. No dramatic music swells. No slow motion. Just a voice, barely above a whisper, carrying news so devastating that the surgeons standing in blood-stained gowns simply freeze. Audiences across America froze too. In that single moment, a television comedy did something no comedy had ever dared to do before. It killed one of its most beloved characters, without warning, without mercy, and without apology. That scene did not happen because of brilliant writing alone. It happened because an actor had already decided to walk away. And that decision set off a chain of departures that would quietly reshape one of the greatest television series ever made. MASH ran for 11 seasons between 1972 and 1983, outlasting the actual Korean War it was set in by nearly a decade. It began as a sharp, irreverent comedy about army surgeons trying to stay sane in the middle of a war they didn't choose. It ended as something far more profound, a meditation on grief, resilience, and what it costs human beings to survive impossible circumstances. Along the way, it won Emmy Awards, broke ratings records, and permanently changed what audiences expected from television. But the show we remember so fondly was never a stable, fixed thing. It was constantly being remade, often because the people who built it were leaving. Some left chasing bigger dreams. Some left because they were quietly burning out. Some left because they felt the show had outgrown the space it gave them. And in at least one case, an actor simply walked away from a handshake deal without ever looking back. Each departure left a visible scar on the series, and yet, somehow, MASH absorbed every loss and continued to deepen. Understanding why these actors left is not just backstage trivia. It is the story of how a television show grows up, and what it asks of the people who carry it. McClean Stevenson was one of the original pillars of MASH. He played Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake, the commanding officer of the 4077th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, and from the very first episode, he brought something irreplaceable to the role. Henry Blake was not a hero in any conventional sense. He was bumbling, well-meaning, easily flustered, and somehow endearing in all of it. He was the kind of authority figure audiences immediately understood, not cruel, not incompetent exactly, just hopelessly out of his depth in a situation that no training could have prepared him for. McClean played that quality with real warmth and genuine comic timing, and the audience responded to him immediately. He received a Golden Globe nomination for the role and was recognized widely as one of the key reasons the show found its footing in those early seasons. But behind the scenes, McClean was struggling with something that had nothing to do with talent or chemistry. He was struggling with ambition. As MASH evolved, the creative center of the show began to shift, slowly but unmistakably, toward Alan Alda's character, Hawkeye Pierce. Alda, who was not only gifted as a performer but also unusually interested in the craft of writing and directing, became increasingly involved in shaping the show's direction. His character grew more complex, more morally driven, more central to every major storyline. For McClean, this shift was difficult to accept. He had come to MASH believing it would be a true ensemble piece, a show where the comedic and emotional weight would be shared. What he found instead was that he was being gradually repositioned as a supporting player in a story that increasingly belonged to someone else. In interviews he gave during and after his time on the show, McClean was remarkably candid about his feelings. He wanted to be the lead. He wanted to carry a show on his own shoulders. He believed he had the talent and the charisma to do it, and he wasn't wrong to believe that. What he may have underestimated was just how rare the particular alchemy of MASH was, and how difficult it would be to recreate outside of it. When McClean told the producers he would not be returning for Season 4, the creative team faced a decision. They could write Henry Blake off gently, the way these things were usually handled, with a transfer or a reassignment and perhaps a warm farewell. Instead, they chose to do something that had almost no precedent in American television at the time. They decided that Henry Blake would die. Not off-screen, not implied, but stated plainly and without cushioning, in the final moments of the season finale. the episode itself was built to feel like a happy ending. Henry receives his discharge papers. There are parties, emotional goodbyes, a sense of relief. For nearly the entire runtime, it feels like a story closing on a hopeful note. And then Radar walks in. And the room goes quiet. And the war, which the show had always been dancing around the edges of, steps fully into the frame. The response from audiences was unlike anything the network had experienced. CBS received an enormous volume of letters in the days following the broadcast. Many were letters of genuine praise, written by people who recognized that the show had done something courageous. Others were angry, hurt, even furious. Some viewers felt betrayed by the sudden loss of a character they had come to love. But the creative team stood by their decision, and history has vindicated them completely. That moment remains one of the most discussed and studied scenes in the history of American television, and it transformed MASH from a popular show into something closer to a cultural institution. What McClean found after leaving, unfortunately, did not match the scale of what he had walked away from. His subsequent projects, including a self-titled sitcom and another series called Hello, Larry, struggled to connect with audiences and critics alike. In later years, McClean spoke with real honesty about the choices he had made. He acknowledged, in various interviews throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, that leaving MASH had been a mistake he came to understand only in hindsight. He described the experience as the kind of rare convergence of talent, material, and timing that does not come twice in a career. He was right about that. He passed away in 1996, remembered by his colleagues with deep affection, and remembered by audiences for a character whose final exit had more emotional power than most actors achieve in an entire career. Wayne Rogers arrived at MASH the same year McClean did, playing Captain Trapper John McIntyre, Hawkeye's closest friend, partner in mischief, and fellow surgeon. If McClean's Henry Blake was the befuddled authority figure, Wayne's Trapper was the co-lead of the entire enterprise. He and Alda had immediate on-screen chemistry, the kind that feels effortless but is actually the product of two skilled performers who genuinely respect each other. Their banter was fast, their comedic timing was sharp, and their friendship felt entirely believable even inside the absurdity of a wartime surgical unit. Wayne had studied history at Princeton and brought a genuine intellectual quality to everything he did. He understood storytelling, and he understood the importance of character development. And as MASH moved through its early seasons, what he saw happening to Trapper John began to bother him. The show was changing. The moral complexity and emotional weight were being concentrated more and more in Hawkeye's storylines. Trapper, who had begun as a genuine co-lead, was gradually becoming a reactor, a character who responded to what Hawkeye did and felt rather than initiating his own arcs. In Wayne's own words, Trapper had become the character who mostly nodded at everything the other guy said. This was not about ego. Wayne was not the kind of performer who needed to be the center of attention. What bothered him was a storytelling problem. Trapper John, as originally conceived, had been a fully realized person with his own perspective and his own relationship to the war. What he was becoming was a supporting function in someone else's story. Wayne raised his concerns with the producers, but the direction of the show had already been established. When his contract came up for renewal at the end of season 3, he declined to sign a new one. Here is where the situation became genuinely unusual. Wayne's original contract had never been formalized in the traditional sense. There was no signed legal document binding him to the show in a way that would have given the producers clear grounds to compel him to continue or to sue him for leaving. When the production team initially threatened legal action, they quickly discovered that the threat had no real foundation. Wayne had simply walked away from an informal agreement, and there was nothing to be done about it. The consequences for the show were significant. The writers had almost no lead time to address Trapper's departure in the storyline. When season 4 began, the explanation was handled quickly and without ceremony. Trapper had received his discharge and gone home while Hawkeye was away on leave. There was no farewell scene, no emotional send-off, no final conversation between the two central characters of the show's first 3 years. Audiences were understandably jarred by the abruptness of it. The man had been there since the beginning, and then he simply wasn't. The character brought in to fill the void Trapper left behind was B.J. Honeycutt, played by Mike Farrell. B.J. was a deliberate departure from the Trapper template. Where Trapper had been brash and irreverent, B.J. was quieter, more emotionally open, more visibly troubled by the moral weight of what the surgeons were being asked to do. The change in dynamic took some adjustment, but over time, many viewers came to feel that MASH actually deepened in significant ways after the transition. The show became more willing to sit with its own sadness, less dependent on pure comedy as a defense mechanism. Wayne went on to build a remarkably successful second career in finance and investment, eventually becoming a recognized commentator on economic affairs. He was, by all accounts, genuinely content with the choices he had made. When he passed away in 2015 at the age of 82, Alan Alda's tribute was warm and personal. He described Wayne as one of the smartest people he had ever worked with, and someone whose absence from the set he had felt for years. The friendship, it seems, outlasted the professional parting without much difficulty on either side. Gary Burghoff's story is the one that carries the most weight, because his reasons for leaving were the most deeply human. Gary played Corporal Walter Radar O'Reilly from the very beginning of the series, and he was the only cast member who had also appeared in Robert Altman's original 1970 film. On screen, Radar was the soul of the 4077th. He had an almost supernatural intuition, a sweetness that felt entirely genuine, and a vulnerability that made him one of the most emotionally resonant characters on the show. Audiences adored him. The character became iconic in a way that went beyond popularity. He represented something essential about innocence and the cost of war. Off-screen, Gary was carrying a much heavier load than most people realized. The production schedule for MASH was relentless, and Gary was a perfectionist who took the work extremely seriously. He also struggled with anxiety and depression throughout his time on the show, though these were not topics that received much public discussion in the 1970s. The emotional demands of playing a character as sensitive and exposed as Radar took a genuine toll on him. He was also, by the later seasons, deeply troubled by the time the show was taking away from his family. He had a young daughter he wanted to be present for, and the long hours on set were making that impossible. The producers tried to accommodate his needs as best they could. At various points, they reduced his episode count and gave him additional time away from set. But the fundamental tension between what the role demanded and what Gary needed for his own well-being was never fully resolved. By the time he made the decision to leave at the end of season 7, he had been carrying that weight for years. His farewell was handled with real care by the writing staff. The two-part episode that sent Radar home was among the most emotionally complex pieces of television the show ever produced. Radar returns from leave to find the 4077th struggling without him, and for a while, he tries to hold everything together the way he always had. But eventually, he accepts that his time there is finished. His mother needs him. His community needs him. And perhaps most importantly, he needs to go. The final image of Radar walking away from the camp, his teddy bear left behind on Hawkeye's bunk, was one of those television moments that lodges permanently in the memory. It was not sad in a simple way. It was the kind of sadness that feels true. After MASH, Gary spent years stepping back from the entertainment industry entirely. He turned to painting, to wildlife conservation, and eventually to invention, holding several patents over the course of his life. He described his departure from acting as a necessary act of self-preservation, a decision to reclaim the parts of his life that years of demanding professional work had slowly eroded. That description does not sound like regret. It sounds like a man who understood, clearly and without bitterness, exactly what he had needed to do. Larry Linville played Major Frank Burns for 5 seasons, and the case could be made that no actor on MASH was asked to do something more thankless for longer. Frank was the show's primary antagonist in its early years, a character defined by his pettiness, his rigidity, his need to enforce rules he himself frequently violated, and his capacity to be wrong about almost everything while remaining utterly convinced of his own correctness. He was funny, in the specific way that a character can be funny when they embody a particular kind of human smallness so precisely that audiences recognize it immediately. But Larry Linville was a trained and serious actor with considerably more range than the role ever required him to demonstrate. For 5 seasons, he played essentially the same character beat, again and again, with small variations. Frank never grew. Frank never learned. Frank was, structurally, a cartoon, and the show needed him to remain a cartoon because his function was to be the thing Hawkeye and Trapper pushed against. By the end of season 5, Larry had made a clear-eyed assessment of the situation and decided that he had taken the character as far as the role would allow. He was not fired. He was not pressured to leave. He simply recognized that staying meant more of the same, indefinitely, and that his own growth as a performer required him to seek work that would challenge him differently. His departure was professional, amicable, and honest. What his exit made possible for MASH was significant. With Frank Burns gone, the show no longer needed a cartoon villain to generate conflict. It was free to find its tension in subtler, more interesting places, in moral disagreement, in institutional failure, in the simple grinding weight of too many deaths and not enough time to process them. The character brought in to replace Frank as the show's primary antagonist, if that word even applies, was Charles Emerson Winchester III, played by David Ogden Stiers. Winchester was cultivated, intelligent, snobbish, and genuinely skilled. He was exactly the kind of opponent who made Hawkeye work harder, because unlike Frank, Winchester was never simply wrong. He was often right, just cold about it. David Ogden Stiers brought an unusual combination of formal theatrical training and genuine comic instinct to the role, and over the seasons he remained on the show, Winchester evolved into one of its most compelling figures. He stayed until the very end, appearing in the series finale and delivering what many consider one of the most quietly devastating character moments in the show's entire run. His decision not to join the subsequent spin-off production was characteristically thoughtful. He felt the character had completed his journey. There was nothing more to say that wouldn't diminish what had already been said. In 2009, David publicly came out as gay in an interview, explaining that he had kept his personal life private for most of his career out of genuine concern that disclosure might affect the professional opportunities available to him, particularly during years when he was doing voice work for major studios. His candor, when it came, was received with warmth and respect. He passed away in 2018, widely mourned by colleagues and audiences alike. And then there is Loretta Swit, who never left at all, and whose presence across all 11 seasons tells its own important story. Margaret Houlihan began as a punchline. The nickname the show gave her in its early seasons was not subtle, and the character as originally conceived was closer to a foil for the male leads than a fully developed human being. Loretta Swit refused to accept that limitation. Season by season, she pushed for Margaret to be given more complexity, more contradiction, more of the interior life that the character clearly possessed but that the writing sometimes neglected to explore. By the time MASH ended, Margaret Houlihan was one of the most fully realized characters on the show. She was not simply the tough nurse or the romantic interest or the rule follower. She was a career military officer who had dedicated her life to a profession that her male colleagues often treated as secondary, and who had found, over 11 years of war, that her own certainties were more complicated than she had originally believed. Loretta's commitment to that evolution, her refusal to let the character be defined by its earliest and least interesting version, was itself a kind of departure, a departure from the easier version of the role. MASH changed American television in ways that are still being felt. It demonstrated that a comedy could carry genuine grief without losing its humor. It proved that audiences were willing to follow characters through real growth and real loss over years of storytelling. And it did all of this while navigating an extraordinary number